facilitating our call tonight. Um, I'm an organizer with the Homes Guarantee Campaign and People's Action. And before we begin, I want to introduce our interpreter on tonight's call, Irene. Irene will be providing Spanish interpretation tonight. We know we are not there yet, but we are working to improve how communication works for folks speaking different languages. Irene, you want to say a few words about interpretation tonight?
Yes, hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me. I just wanted to say, please, if we could speak slowly and clearly and not speak over each other to make sure that nothing is lost in interpretation. Thank you.
Great. So to switch over to Spanish interpretation, click the button that says interpretation at the bottom of your screen to change it from English to Spanish. If you've dialed in by phone and need interpretation, unfortunately, it's only available if you're logged into the Zoom app and can access the video conference. So if you can, install that on your phone or desktop, you should be able to follow those same instructions. If you have a question and you're joining us through the Zoom app, you can type it into the question and answer box that you see at the bottom of your screen, and we'll respond to as many as we can later in the program. Feel free to use the chat box to communicate with other participants. If you're not on Zoom and just dial into the phone, that's more than okay. We're glad you're all here. Just so you know, we are recording this call to share with people who weren't able to join us tonight. And we do not intend for this to be a media call, but speakers should assume that they are in public and on record. Finally, we want to just let you know this call is scheduled to wrap up by the end of the hour. So let's see who's here. If you can drop your name, organization, and where you're from in the chat, and let's get into it. So this Homes Guarantee campaign started about 2 years ago with a retreat where a group of leaders challenged organizers and our organizations to think bigger and bolder about what it takes to change the housing market in the United States. And the simple idea that in the richest country in the history of the world, everyone should be guaranteed a home. What we've seen in the past few months has been nothing short of mind-blowing. We've seen a COVID-19 pandemic that has forced the country to shut down, which has created massive unemployment. While there are some reports out there of employment numbers improving as folks go back to work, we all know that in our communities, I definitely don't see that on the ground in Buffalo, New York, and I know most of the organizers and leaders that I talk to around the country are still seeing folks who are still waiting for the unemployment that they were promised at the beginning of the pandemic. We know so many folks did not receive that $1,200 check that was truly an insult to what it takes to live in this country, especially in communities like New York, Bay Area, San Francisco, Atlanta, where we're seeing average rents, over $2,000. We're coming up on eviction moratoriums that are expiring. There are many in our cohort who are working diligently to continue to extend these eviction moratoriums. But we also know that the only solution to this crisis is rent and mortgage cancellation. The eviction moratoriums are a stall tactic designed to delay the inevitable, which is massive evictions because of this unemployment. Our country is actually reopening, and despite the evidence of massive coronavirus spikes across the country, due to this reopening, folks are still pressing for people to reopen and go back to work. We have seen record numbers of coronavirus cases in the past 3 or 4 weeks. We have seen some states where coronavirus cases there have exceeded those in the rest of the world. Florida and Texas now represent 54% of the increase in coronavirus cases within the last month. And then, in addition to all of that, unemployment and the extra unemployment that was introduced early on in the pandemic is going to expire on July 31st. So many folks who have been receiving unemployment have been receiving an extra $600 a month, and that will end on July 31st unless Congress takes action. So we have a perfect storm here of a housing crisis on top of a housing crisis. We know that when folks are unable to pay their rent, we know that when folks are unable to pay their mortgages, in combination with the over $8 trillion that the Federal Reserve has put out for the wealthiest people in America and for the biggest banks in America to buy back up our housing market and sell it back to us. And in fact, recently Steve Mnuchin said that he wants to cap any future assistance at 100% of the income that folks were making before the coronavirus started. Now, what that means is there were some people who were actually making a little bit more money from the unemployment benefits than they were making at their jobs. And to me, what that says is that people in the United States are grossly underpaid, especially people of color, people who are in our service industry, people who do the hardest and worst jobs in this country. And we have Steve Mnuchin, the king of foreclosure in California, who made billions of dollars buying up the land that people labored so hard to acquire, especially people of color in Southern California, and really sold that back to them in a form of gentrification that is unseen. Now he's bought his way into the US Treasury and is making sure that folks will not receive the benefits that they need. All this paints a pretty bleak picture for the future. But the reality is we've all existed in this country and in this system, and we all understand what it's designed to do, and we are folks who've decided to resist that. And I appreciate everyone for the powerful work that they're doing. And what we want to do tonight is really reflect on what's happened in the past few months with the Homes Guarantee campaign in each one of our communities, and how we regroup and really strategically look at how we're going to build the power in the future to match the Homes Guarantee vision that we set out 2 years ago to create. We've accomplished a lot working with Ilhan Omar on our cancel rent bill. Folks in states across the country that are part of our cohort have made great progress in reducing the harm of the coronavirus and in building new infrastructures because of how many people have felt a loss of privilege or have been challenged by the way and the failure the federal government has had to truly address this crisis. So while we are in crisis, there is always opportunity. And we know that we've been doing the work to challenge ourselves to think about what we need to do moving forward to build the kind of campaign that will ultimately guarantee everyone a home and will be the path to recovery from this crisis.
Hey,
so we
John,
have, yes.
Sorry, can I just jump in? Can you
Sure.
make me the host of the meeting so I can turn on interpretation?
Yes.
Thanks. You just have to right-click my face.
Sorry about that. So now we have really three amazing leaders from our campaign who are going to share some of the reflections on their personal experience with the campaign in the past few months, so we can get a sense of where we're at. And then we'll definitely be posing some questions to the folks who've joined us to really ground ourselves in where we're at as a campaign in this moment, where organizers are at, and where leaders are at in their communities, and talk about how we're going to build forward from this moment. So I want to give it up for Push leader and organizer, Angel Rosado.
Hello, my name's Angel Rosado. I'm the interim housing justice organizer in Push Buffalo, here in Buffalo, New York. I can say this is definitely, being 100% honest, not even just with the Homes Guarantee, but completely from day one has been a learning process, and nothing has been what I expected it to be. I was brought into the interim role in the beginning of April, which coincides with the start of Corona really shutting everything down. And I can say that, one of the things I've learned over this time is campaigns are really hard. Like we see successful campaigns that happen, and we see political campaigns and candidates who run and get all this support. But when it's time to really run a campaign, and you start looking at the inner workings and the strategy and just the organizing that goes behind it, it's a lot of work, and it's a lot harder than, we realize. And so that has to come with, humility. Since the beginning of COVID, even with the Homes Guarantee in general, a lot of what's been happening is very humbling. It's been a lot of trial and error, and a lot of understanding that like when something doesn't work out, it's not that like it's over and I lost, but like it's time to go back to the table and like figure out where my organizing went wrong, and how to, and the fact that like all of it starts from base building. Is that, you know, like having a campaign that's successful depends on how large your base is and how much of your base is actually passionate. And so, you know, we talk about structure and like core groups and all the different parts of a campaign. Like the biggest thing I've learned is like it all goes back to your base. No matter what you do, no matter what campaign you're running, issue based, an electoral, you know, it doesn't really matter. And being on the retreat, you know, the two biggest things I take from that were humility and then like structuring your campaign around having a base. Being able to say, you know, this didn't work. You know, maybe we didn't drop the ball. Maybe we just did our best and it just didn't work out. And, you know, sometimes it happens like that. But that's when you come back together as a group, you have these discussions, you talk about what we can do moving forward to hold each other accountable and to make sure that the work, you know, is better. And, you know, those are the things that we don't get to see a lot of times when we're looking at other organizers and people we look up to and people that inspire us. We don't see their failures, and we don't see when they had to go back to the drawing board. And so for me, this entire process has just been learning to like take like every step and just keep going, whether it's forward or backwards. And that no matter what, you just got to keep actually building your base and building that support, in order to really win the campaigns that you want to fight for.
Angel, can you talk a little bit about some of the base building work that you've been doing during this rebellion phase that we've had, and some of the lessons that you've learned and people that you've been engaging with, and ways that you've been finding to find new people to engage while we've been dealing with the coronavirus and this rebellion moment?
So in a new way of engagement, because I love canvassing, I'm huge into door knocking. That's like my favorite part of organizing. Is like scouring like Facebook groups, honestly. Like there's a lot of Facebook groups that popped up for like mutual aid, for like the evictions and the housing crisis, for jobs, for all types of things. And just being in those groups and like seeing people's posts and their comments and like the pain that people are sharing openly on Facebook is like, you know, like you gotta, it may seem a little weird at first to just message a stranger, but like when you know, you take that step and you're like, hey, I saw that you posted in this group about, you know, your struggles with paying rent, or like your wife got laid off or furloughed. And, you know, just opening that communication, that's been one way of just like, you kind of like going outside of the norm, you know, like individualism kind of convinces us that like just messaging people through the internet sometimes is weird and that like we shouldn't do it. But in a time like this, you know, it's especially important to take those steps. And again, like humility and just putting your like little pride aside, or like your own like little judgments, and just saying like, this is where people are. Like we talk about meeting people where they're at, and where they're at is Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, like voicing their concerns. So that's been huge. And you know, more in a deeper note, we've had a rebellion that popped up here in the square across the street from our city hall, and you know, just going down there saying, listen, these people, they're crying for help, they're crying for mentorship, they're crying for a campaign, for a passion, for a cause, and saying, you know what, listen, I'm going to put my mask on, I'm going to put some gloves on, and you know, get some hand sanitizer, wash my hands, and get ready to go down there. And just taking that step to like, let's go down there and just meet these people, and let's take every safety precaution possible, you know. But at the end of the day, like that's another example of meeting people where they're at. And I've met a super great group of people who have come to like really support me and like, you know, support my work, and are like willing to sign petitions and are coming to my meetings and things like that, you know. And now we support each other. And so I think like a lot of it is just taking those steps, you know, that like we may be afraid to take, but you know, it's necessary in this time. It's not as simple as just knocking on someone's door and they either answer or they don't.
Cool. Yeah, I guess we'll take it over to Bo now. Bo, you've been joining us on Homes Guarantee calls for a while, and have recently been more deeply engaged in our cohort, and definitely really excited to make more plans on how we can continue to work with the Lexington Housing Collective. But yeah, if you could just kind of reflect on how you got to where you're at here and what's been going on with your organizing in the past few months.
Yeah, for sure. So like John said, I'm an organizer with the Lexington Housing Justice Collective, and we're a fairly new organization. We've been around for about a year now. And we, right before the pandemic hit, we were doing a lot of canvassing and base building to like work on articulating what a local homes guarantee would look like and engage people in that. And then whenever COVID hit, everybody lost their jobs. We started social distancing. We realized that we needed to change two things. We needed to change our tactics because we couldn't be door knocking. And we needed to change what our goal was because we recognized immediately as you're losing income, people aren't going to be able to pay rent. And so we needed a way to prevent people getting evicted. And, this was happening all across the country. And this was around the time that these Homes Guarantee Thursdays calls got started. So started hopping on these, and we organized a cancel rent campaign in Kentucky. So we're a citywide organization, and this is the first time we had done anything statewide. But at this time in March, April, May, housing was what all organizers were talking about, and not just organizers. It was like that was what people are talking about. All the news articles were about people not being able to pay rent. Everybody was like, what are we going to do about these evictions? And people were talking about rent strike. Cancel rent seemed like a possibility. And we in Kentucky felt really hopeful because we managed to build a really strong like cross-movement coalition, cross-movement and cross-locality coalition, where we had a BLM chapter on board, we had Sunrise Movement hubs on board, we had other climate justice groups, and some like mainstream like liberal organizations were even on board with this. And so we thought that we really had a shot, and organized a lot of direct actions, both like locally in different parts of the state, and had some coordinated stuff statewide and at our state capitol. And at the end of the day, we never even got a response from our governor. And that was really, really deflating. And through all this was happening through the end of May 30th was like, we had a big action at the state capitol. And then we're here in Kentucky is where Breonna Taylor was shot in Louisville. And so all of our energy after really from May 30th on was in the uprising. Louisville's been holding down a lot of work, and in Lexington, we've been having pretty much daily actions for a month and a half now. And just been really very little housing organizing since then. And a lot of the groups that were part of our coalition have rightfully shifted to focus on this uprising, including us. Like we ran the jail support and the bail fund for Lexington, and still are. So I think that the reflections that I have on this are that like throughout this whole pandemic, we were really trying to struggle with how do we continue to build our base and to reach tenants who are like currently facing these problems while we can't be knocking on doors, while we can't be meeting people where they are. And like Angel said, like there are a bunch of Facebook groups, and we tried to engage people from that, but a lot of times if we aren't able to talk to people face to face, we'll have like one conversation and then they don't follow up, or they just want to find someone who can help them pay their rent. They're not really interested in organizing their building. And so we really struggled throughout it on like, we're putting in so much effort to plan these actions and building this statewide power that we haven't had before, but we don't have the base to really support it. And we haven't given the time to think strategically about how we build that creatively during COVID. And so we've really shifted to focusing on that now after realizing that like, we don't think that we have the statewide power, especially because I started thinking about, the difference between organizing organizers, which is I think what we were doing. We had a bunch of people who were already organizers who were engaged in the campaign and building this coalition versus organizing people to become organizers. People who are, tenants who are facing these problems and about to be evicted, and giving people skills and the understanding that this is a political problem and a collective problem, and here are tools. So really shifting into that is what we've been doing recently, and also been trying to think about how do we sustain the momentum when housing's not what everybody is talking about anymore. Like, we need to be engaged in collective liberation. We need to be building these cross-movement connections with, the uprising for Black Lives. And but all the time, we need to be working on everybody's issues. And that means that us as the housing movement needs to ensure that we continue momentum and make the connections at the proper moment. So yeah, that's where we've been.
I really appreciate that, especially, just the reflections often, not getting exactly where you need to go can be very deflating. But the reality is what I also heard was there's some new infrastructures, there's some new relationships, and there's really a lot to build off of, and want to really push us to get out of this linear thinking that our power is based on how many people come to our meetings, as opposed to how many people are in the process of the development where they'll be able to build more power. So hear a lot of great progress, even though, that your governor didn't respond. Most governors have not fully responded. And even our governor Cuomo has responded with some of the greatest trickery of politics that I've ever seen. So yeah, I want to transition to our triple OG, Linda Armitage, who's been building power in Chicago with elders and other residents in her building, to hear her reflections.
Thank you, John. So here we are, 2 years after the grassroots retreat, where the People's Action Homes Guarantee campaign was born. At that retreat, we decided that we wanted to fight for more than one or two incremental housing reforms, and a consensus emerged to put teeth into the theme of the retreat, which was housing is a human right. And we wanted to be really radical and challenge the richest country in the history of the world to guarantee an affordable, safe, and decent home to anyone who needed it. Our three teams, the policy team, grassroots, and organizing, collaborated to produce a briefing book on the Homes Guarantee vision in just under 1 year. It includes our ultimate demand of social housing managed by residents with the oversight of a true people's HUD. No Ben Carsons allowed. Legislation based on our vision has been produced but languishes in the Senate. At our retreat 2 weeks ago, we decided to commit major efforts to a basic structural reform of our work in order to engage a broader base of support to move more quickly to our ultimate goals. Thus far, we have spent most of our time and energy emphasizing the legislative requirements for a homes guarantee. And we do have much to be proud of. For example, we assisted Representative Ilhan Omar to write her two major bills, the Housing for All Act and the Rent and Cancellation and Mortgage Cancellation Act. And of course, we remain vigilant as to what our elected officials are saying and doing about housing issues to ensure that people's needs and lives come before obscene profits. It is now time, however, our time, to devote a major effort to increase base building. Protests and demonstrations are growing against the lack of health care in the midst of this pandemic, against rampant police brutality, and in favor of rent strikes and no evictions. The realization that the political leaders of both parties have refused to do what is so badly needed has become very clear to many people, and they are demanding action to stop the pain and the suffering and the death. We aim to develop deep relationships with housing organizations, tenant unions, and individuals affected with the housing movement, including the members of marginalized groups, marginalized people, and regions. Now we have an unprecedented opportunity to emphasize base building for a larger movement of housing justice and the need for a homes guarantee. We need to strike while the iron is hot, so to speak, and gather supporters and elected officials at all levels of government into our movement so that together we can help lead the way to a better world for all. We have made considerable progress individually and collectively, but there is still a very long way to go. Our communities need so much love, and our opposition will spare no expense to fight us. But I believe our team can do anything we decide to do because we've already become so far and refuse to reverse course. We made personal commitments to each other over the past 2 years and renewed that commitment in our second retreat 2 weeks ago. We are reiterating that commitment today. We must win a homes guarantee. Millions of homeless and rent-burdened persons in the richest country in the history of the world deserve a homes guarantee. Nothing short of that will do.
Wow. That was so powerful. I really appreciate that reflection. One of the things that we talked about a lot in our retreat was the difference and really just clarifying structural reforms. So we started this campaign to have a bold vision to match the housing crisis, but have definitely gotten clear that we need to think more directly about what are the stepping stones and what are the milestones and how do we know we're getting there and how do we know that we're making progress. Do any of you want to talk a little bit about that work and some of the reflections you had from the exercises we did around structural reform there?
Okay, I am organizing and leading in one of those smaller groups. It's a senior group, and right now they're very frightened, and because we are in one of the higher groups at risk, and sometimes I think that most of us in, let's say, my generation aren't really used to standing up for our rights. And that's basically what I'm trying to do among our members and in my building too. And this just fits right in to base building because, I mean, right now people are scared. They're worried about their families, etc. Their grandchildren. Are things going to be fixed by the time their grandchildren grow up? And it's very, very, very stressful and traumatic time. And I think that the People's Action Group going into building a base is going to help me a lot more because I've learned a bit more, not just how to approach people. And also, as I think Angel said, don't get too down when things don't go your way. You just have to keep going, try different things. And this is what the People's Action right now, the Homes Guarantee is doing. We're realizing, hey, we haven't built enough power. So let's get on the ball and do it. And that's what I have to do in my work with Jane Addams Senior Caucus. And fortunately, I have some other people in the organization who, are willing to help and willing to stand up and make their voices heard more. So the whole base building idea came at the absolutely right time for me.
Yeah, Bo or Angel, you don't have to, but any just reflections about, the ideas of the structural reforms and some of the work that we were able to do in the retreat to clarify some of where we might be going.
I wasn't able to be on that part of the retreat, so
Okay, cool.
probably not me.
I think my biggest reflection and my biggest takeaway from when we talked about, strategy and reform, and the goals we wanted to see and how we were going to get there is the idea of building out from a core group, and just how distributed organizing can look. And that, like, if we want to win things on a mass scale, then those are the type of models we need to look at, and really put trust in our leaders. Like, we spend time investing into our leaders, developing them into the leaders we believe they can be. We need to trust that they can take on responsibilities, and that, if we don't put that trust in them, then we're doing it all ourselves. We're not going to reach the real structural reform that we want. It's going to always be incremental and empty promises.
Absolutely. And I think that also goes back to what Linda talked about as far as our mindset and the culture. And I don't think it's just your generation or even any generation itself, but there is definitely a culture in our society of not standing up for your rights, and of thinking that, if you're the nail that's sticking up, that you're going to get hammered down. And so I know that's a big barrier for base building, is people's mindset and the way that they look at. And then the fact that, a lot of folks are not clear on the wins and the victories and the ways in which organizing and movement has shaped the way the world works. And so I think, like what Linda said was just so profound around how so much of what we need to do is actually work with people on building their own sense of power and their own sense of dignity. And I think that's a deep reason why some of our efforts recently have just been hard to get people engaged, because COVID really has taken the wind out of a lot of people's sails, and really has folks feeling like they're up against a pandemic in addition to all of the things that existed before it. So I want to give an opportunity here for folks to put questions in the Q&A or in the chat, comments, reflections. Is this resonating with you about the work that you're doing? And yeah, let's hear some folks from our audience and in the chat about what you're thinking about based on these reflections, based on some of the conversations that we've been having. All right, and Stephen, yes, so definitely can get back to you, and we can definitely, talk more on the phone and think about how we can work with you to build power in your area. So another thing that we really talked about within the framework of base building is self-interest, and really how we're connecting people's housing stories to the issues that they're dealing with. I know personally that I got a lot out of hearing the stories of many of the leaders on our retreat and on our calls, and it's definitely helped me think about how to make sure that we're always connecting some of these bigger ideas and these structural reforms that may not really resonate with people initially, and thinking about how powerful the storytelling is. I know that, doing the exercise where, we've asked folks to reflect on their housing story, on why they moved, where they moved, and who was really pushing people out of where they lived, was powerful for me. Anyone on our panel here want to talk about their housing story and how doing that exercise, either at this retreat or when we've done it previously, has helped them ground in their own self-interest?
Yeah, like, as somebody who's moved around a lot, probably I think was 5 or 6 times in like 12 or 13 years, I think we had talked about something like that. Like, and being that I was also really young when I started moving around, it's, as a kid, you don't think about these kind of things, but now, in hindsight, looking at the reasons why we moved, of like, the landlord just wants us gone just so he can renovate the house, and like one landlord bought our house and the house next door and wanted to convert them into one big house. Like, it's not necessary, One person lost the house to some like very shady backdoor dealings because somebody else wanted it. And they lost the house. The new guy got it like he wanted and put us out. And just like a realization of like, when I think back on it, how much shady stuff happens, that then also falls on us, even though we weren't the intended target. You know, as the tenant, you know, anything bad that happens to the landlord, you know, ultimately then does fall on you. And like that kind of realization hit me with like, wow, like we really need better protections as tenants, because if something happens with the landlord, you know, like that's not our fault. You could be the 1 in a million time where your landlord is actually a good person, you know, like maybe you guys have a working relationship, the like stars all align somehow, right? But if they lose the house for whatever reason, then you got a new person and now they want you out, you know. And so it's just like the realization of how much falls on us at the end of the day.
Cool. Does anybody else want to take a stab at addressing that? Yeah, go ahead, Linda.
In the exercise we did, other than moving once for a job and once for education, I moved about 6 times within Chicago, and I realized it was always for the money and or the conditions. I've lived in one building on the north side that was totally infested with bugs and rodents and everything, and the landlord did absolutely nothing about it. And then how I got into housing organizing is I lost a lot in the 10 years ago in the financial crisis, moved into a building that 6 months after I moved in was sold to a very high, greedy developer. And we were supposed to have subsidized housing for life with our previous owner. And so we organized and saved what we, you know, we saved our lives, but right now we're living with a landlord is the Chicago Housing Authority, which isn't easy. So yeah, you know, money and conditions can take an awful toll on people, especially at my age, and there were 120 seniors affected by that it would have been a forced move because they didn't give us that long to get out once the greedy developer wanted us out right away. So fortunately we got some help and managed to save our building and our roof over our heads, but we're still struggling.
Thanks for sharing. Well, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that I've always found it really valuable whenever we do exercises in Lexington Housing Justice Collective to ground us in our housing stories, because I often find that people don't realize how their personal experience is impacted by structural issues. Like sometimes people are motivated by injustice in general, but don't even connect it to their lives. So doing these kinds of things where it's just simple questions like how many times have you moved, why did you move, can really open people's eyes to the fact that like these structural problems that we're fighting for are happening to ourselves, and that a lot of people, you know, grew up facing these. And I think that it also can highlight, you know, that the story of people's individual housing stories aren't always as simple as like we expect, and can connect across different issues. So like, you know, like I moved 5 times in 7 months because of domestic violence. And we usually don't, you know, conceptualize that as a housing justice issue, but these are things that really affect the stability of a person's life, and that having, you know, stable, affordable social housing that anyone could access easily would prevent people from having to couch surf, would prevent people from, you know, their whole life being uprooted unpredictably. And so I think that having people tell these housing stories will both like motivate people to engage and also expand our understanding as organizers of the different connections that the housing movement has to make.
And I really appreciate those. And we have a question here from Leonard, and he's basically saying, are you having success getting support from local housing authorities, city and county governments to make money available for support for affordable housing and moving in the direction of community-owned or guaranteed housing? Anybody want to take a shot at that?
The answer here in Lexington is no. We just passed a COVID budget at the end of last month, and initially we have a Republican mayor. We're one of the most conservative cities in the country, and our mayor, in her proposed budget, we have an affordable housing fund that's bullshit anyway. It's money for developers to build housing for basically middle-class people, and that doesn't reach the people with the most need. And there's only $2 million in this, which can't build shit, anything at all. And she, in this proposed budget, cut it from $2 million to $600,000 for a city of 300,000 people. And it was restored, like it took fighting to get the funding restored to 2 million, but really we need, like 50 million or more, and we need it to be reaching a totally different group of people than it is right now. So in Lexington, it's totally not a priority. It's like the last thing on our city government's mind. And of course, they're funding cops, giving more and more money to cops.
Well, I will just push back and say I think that is a success. If you were able even to get it back to what it was supposed to be, it shows an enormous amount of power that they thought that they would be able to move in taking $1.4 million out of the housing system, and that with the power that you have and the power you're building, you were able to push back and maintain it where it is. To me, that is a success, because we know that most communities, a lot of communities don't have affordable housing funds, and there's definitely an effort to dismantle and reallocate those funds. So I would definitely just reframe that a little bit and say may not be where you want to be, but that shows that you have the power, I think, to move forward and get another $1.4 million like added to it with that same level of effort. But we'll make some space for Linda and Angel to address the question if they want to.
Yeah, Chicago is housing is not on any kind of a front burner at all in Chicago, despite what the mayor says. And she's sold herself as a progressive, but she isn't, that's for sure. And as far as the housing authority, they do more to ignore seniors than anything else. The city is pretty much run by upscale builders. Just in the ward that I lived in, there are about 10 brand new buildings now going up, quote unquote, luxury high rises, and no thought to affordable units within those buildings. And we're just finishing up a fight right now just to get basic protection for seniors in light of COVID. It's our senior safety ordinance. Well, everybody, the CHA, all the developers, they're against all that because it's going to cost them a little bit of money, have trained people come in and make sure that the seniors are not dying alone and, do not have the symptoms of COVID, and, and get food and medicine for them. And we've been fighting for 3 months. It's finally out of committee and it will go to city council this month, but it's just gruesome. There's no support at all. It's the luxury condos, the luxury homes that get all the money.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Angel.
I will say, from what I've heard from plenty of other people, BMHA is one of the slummiest of slumlords there is. Like, they tried to sell, well, almost, I didn't say try, they were almost going to sell a whole section of housing that is no longer in use for like $1. Somebody really tried to get it from the city, and they were incredibly close at doing so. And BMHA has shown multiple times on multiple occasions that they're not interested in actually like supporting and taking care of the housing that they're supposed to offer. You know, we have a place called the Perry Projects, which I canvassed back in like October, in November, and I can tell you the conditions are terrible. And it just really shows you how much that like our housing authorities are committed to the housing aspect, or just to having people in there to take rent money from until they sell the property for whatever, you know, dollar amount that they may think is reasonable. I don't think I've met somebody who has a favorable opinion of our housing authority, and they've consistently pushed back against, you know, support and anything like that. And it's just, you know, even like right now, like we're fighting for tenants' rights. Like we're fighting just for people to have rights to even living somewhere.
We do have one piece of good news. The BMHA did cancel its contract with the Buffalo Police Department. And so that has opened up about $600,000 that one of our leaders, Rosado Graham, is working to pay folks in the community to actually build, you know, community healing and those aspects. So, you know, while there definitely is you know, problems and issues, I think this rebellion in this moment was able to leverage a movement for a long time that has been trying to dismantle what used to be called the strike force, but the housing unit of Buffalo housing. So I think that's been some progress that's been made. And I will say, talking to folks around the country, folks in Philadelphia, New York, LA, and other cities have been really making some progress at using this invest-divest frame to start to move some of the resources from police departments into affordable housing funds. And I think that's something that we can really expand on a future call, as it seems like it's resonating with some folks. We had another question here in the chat. Let's see, from Stefan. How could we communicate effectively to folks that building 10 million municipally owned apartments within 10 years in the US will go a long way towards alleviating the housing crisis? Instead of private landlords trying to extract the highest rent and not caring about the people, municipally owned apartments would be nonprofit, built solely for the reason of providing high quality housing at a lower price. So yeah, basically how do we message and communicate that the Homes Guarantee vision?
To me, narrative is often less about what you say than creating the conditions for what you say being able to be heard. And that's about movement. That's about having people in the streets. I think that, you know, Stefan, in your question references in Vienna, where there's a bunch of social housing, like the majority of residents live in social housing, either city-owned or cooperatively owned. And that happened because of movement. Like after World War I, Vienna had socialist uprisings all across the city. And it was like there were communists in the streets every day. So that democratic socialism looked like the moderate option. And so it's about shifting the political landscape. And I think, you know, in 1968, there were uprisings, Black-led uprisings, a lot like what we're seeing right now. And one of the results of that, first the Fair Housing Act, and then the HUD Act of 1968, which explicitly said that we wanted to provide a good house to everyone in the United States, and had a plan to build 26 million housing units in 10 years. 26 million in the US, including 6 million of them subsidized. And that happened because people were in the streets. That happened because the conditions were there to make the message heard. So yeah, I think it's about organizing. Movement works. Movement is the message.
It was really profound.
It's that storytelling, you know, it's just the realization that like more of us go through similar things than we realize. You know, we have a lot more in common with the people down the street from us and on the rest of our block than we sometimes give us and them credit for. And it's only when you start to share your story and you start to talk to people and like let them know what happened to you that they go, oh, you know what? Like, yeah, that sounds like something I went through. You know, my old landlord wouldn't get rid of the rats or the bed bugs or the like we had radiators so our house didn't heat well and they wouldn't bleed them. Like, you know, like there's more people that experience these kind of things than sometimes we think about. And it's, you know, like Bo said about organizing, you know, organizing for me, you know, I think of it as like everybody has this like kindling inside of them. Everybody has this like trauma and these struggles that are just like waiting for a spark. And like the goal as an organizer is to like spark that kindling and then fan that flame so it grows. And like that's how you bring the passion out. And once they feel that flame for themselves is when they do the same for others. Like your fire being hot enough to spark somebody else's, like that's organizing. And it's only through that kind of process that like you get enough people for a movement to be created and for a movement to actually make change. You know, like we got to organize people and or money. And a lot of us have no money to organize. So our power comes from each other. And it's only when you have each other that people listen to you. I could go stand outside of City Hall and scream and yell all the things that make sense as much as I want to. But no matter how much sense they make, no matter what budgets I draw up that would work, it's never going to be paid attention to if it's just me on my own. And that's the same thing with people. People want to see progress. They want to see that things are happening. And, you know, as much as, you know, we would want them to be more proactive, there are a lot of people that are only going to react when they see something happening. But those are the people that we need more than anyone. The people who wouldn't do the work if it wasn't for the fact it's happening. And how do you reach them?
Absolutely. So want to thank all of the folks for the questions. Stefan had a question here about the success that is there. And I'll just say quickly, because we're going to be having to wrap up soon, you know, across the country, there are communities that have canceled rent. You know, Philadelphia and Ithaca come to mind. There are folks who have really pushed on housing issues and really created a lot of space. And I think that we're in a moment where so many people are experiencing housing authority, that base building and the opportunity to stoke those flames, as Angel said, has never been greater. And while in this moment, we may be in struggle around actually, you know, getting the movement that we want, what we've seen is the enormous amount of people who are experiencing housing insecurity, some for the first time in their lives, some people losing privilege, some who've been experiencing it forever, but now see that it literally is defining their ability of life and death, especially when you look at the way that COVID by race is playing out. So we have an enormous opportunity to set a stage to make this recovery really not a recovery, but about guaranteeing those homes. We're seeing the uprisings, you know, that Bo talked about. We're seeing all of the conditions ripe for us to really be able to build serious power. And we're seeing folks who've honestly lost faith in a government that has failed them during this crisis. And historically, you know, those are the moments where folks really do begin to start to build power. So I appreciate folks for sharing their stories, for being on, and want to also highlight that we want to be really responsive and valuable with this time. So if you have any ideas or suggestions about future topics that we can take on these calls, drop them in the chat. And definitely let us know how we can be helpful, because really we feel that our role is facilitating the growth of organizers, facilitating the growth of those bases, facilitating the growth and understanding of leaders, so that we have the capacity to build local power in areas across the country and really be an umbrella for that power to push for the type of social housing that was highlighted in the question that we answered before. So if you have ideas, if you have needs or concerns in your organizing that you feel that we should be finding folks that can address on some of these calls, drop those in the chat. Also want to thank especially Bo, who got to know through being on these calls, for really engaging, for stepping up, and for allowing us to be a part of the housing fights that he's in, because that's how we really are able to strengthen our power. So definitely, and I know Stefan also put out that we need to follow up with him, but looking to definitely build relationships with all the folks who are on these calls, and see how we can get folks engaged in strengthening their local organizing, and getting ready to address Congress, and to try to start to build power, so that we can continue working toward our homes guarantee. So we're going to be starting to do a series on base building, and really get deep in the weeds of some of the folks who've done that base building work, and how they've intersected it with the structural reforms in their campaigns, and making sure that we're also being responsible to the folks who've decided to join our calls. So we'll respect folks' time, and as we said, we'll always try to end on time at 8 o'clock. Again, it's been a really honor and pleasure to share space with Linda, Bo, and Angel, and again, continue to reach out to us. And make sure that you join us for our next Homes Guarantee conversation. That conversation will be happening on July 23rd. We're trying to make space to better prepare for these, and also to make sure that we put out our emails a week before these events are happening, so we can have greater turnout, and hope that folks who are on the line and enjoying this space will continue to build with other people and invite them into the space. I think it's a great way for folks to have a little bit of a taste of the work that we do, to hear some conversations, to build and bond in the chat, and hopefully to get onboarded into our campaign so that we can come back in and support those local campaigns. So again, everyone, thank you for being with us. Hope you enjoyed your time tonight, and have a good night. We're going to hang out here for a few minutes to do a little bit of debriefing. Feel free if you want to hang out for that, but if not, have a great night. Thanks.
Thank you all so much for coming. David.
Thank you to all.
Love you too, David. Appreciate you. You one of the greatest. Straight GOAT status.